Welcome to the Health Headliner podcast by Tudu Digital. Our content is informational only and not medical advice. Please consult your provider. Now, let's dive into today's headlines.
Imagine this. You're going about your day, doing the usual things, maybe a bit of cooking, tidying up, walking to the store. And what if those little bursts of activity, the kind you barely even register as exercise, were actually doing wonders for your heart health, especially as we get older?
That's exactly the exciting area we're diving into today. We're looking at some really recent research exploring the cardiovascular benefits of short periods of moderate movement.
The kind that just sort of happens naturally?
Yeah, incidental activity,
Right.
specifically in older adults who don't really consider themselves regular exercisers.
Exactly. And we've got some fascinating material to unpack here.
Yeah.
We'll be looking at a really clear health news article from the ScienceX network that explains this study pretty well.
Mm-hmm.
And we'll also be digging deep into the original research paper itself, published in the journal Circulation.
That's right, and the title's quite descriptive. Dose response of incidental physical activity against cardiovascular events and mortality.
Right, so our mission today is to pull out the key insights, understand what this research really means for how we can all think about daily movement and heart health.
Especially, like you said, for people who aren't hitting the gym or doing planned workouts.
Okay, so let's start there. What were the researchers actually trying to figure out with this study? What was the main question?
Well, the main aim was to understand how different levels of just everyday movement, what they call incidental physical activity, relate to the risk of major heart problems.
These are like strokes and heart attacks.
Exactly. Major adverse cardiovascular events, so stroke, myocardial infarction or heart attack, heart failure, and cardiovascular death. And also the risk of dying from any cause.
Okay.
And what's really interesting, as we mentioned, is they focused on middle-aged and older adults who specifically identified as non-exercisers.
Because most research looks at people who do exercise.
A lot of it does, yes. It focuses on the benefits of structured, planned exercise. This study wanted to see about the stuff you do just living your life.
So how did they actually measure this incidental activity? It's tricky, isn't it? Not like tracking gym sessions.
Yeah, it is. They used data from a really large health study in the United Kingdom called the UK Biobank. Huge resource.
Oh, I've heard of that.
They looked at info from over 24,000 people, average age around 62, who wore special wrist devices for at least a week, sometime between 2013 and 2015.
Accelerometers.
That's them. Wrist-worn accelerometers. They're really good at recording movement, much better than just asking people.
Definitely. People aren't great at remembering every little thing.
And crucially, all these participants had said they didn't do any structured exercise and didn't take more than one recreational walk per week.
Okay, so a genuinely non-exercising group based on their own reports. So they have the wristband data.
Yeah.
How did they know if someone was just pottering around versus, say, rushing up the stairs? How did they gauge the intensity?
They used a pretty clever system, actually, a validated machine learning-based intensity classifier.
Okay, machine learning is like an algorithm.
Essentially, yes. A smart system trained to analyze the accelerometer data and figuring how intense the movement was. Light, moderate, or vigorous incidental physical activity.
And they checked if this system was accurate.
They did. They validated it against direct observation in a separate sample. And it was pretty good, over 97% accurate for vigorous activity, around 88% for moderate, and just over 80% for light activity.
That's quite solid, especially for just wrist data.
Yeah.
So they've got the activity intensity for these non-exercisers.
Yeah.
What did they look at next?
Then they followed these participants over time for about 8 years on average.
Okay.
And they tracked who experienced one of those major cardiovascular events we talked about or who passed away.
And then connected that back to the activity levels.
Exactly. Using statistical methods to see if there was a link. And importantly, they tried to account for other things that could influence heart health.
Ah, the confounders. Like what?
Things like age, sex, education, ethnicity, diet, smoking, alcohol intake, sleep duration, screen time, any pre-existing conditions like high blood pressure or diabetes, and medication use. They adjusted for a lot.
Right, to try and really isolate the effect of the incidental activity itself. Okay, makes sense. So let's get to the results. What were the main findings? What really stood out?
Well, I think the most significant discovery was that basically any amount of vigorous incidental physical activity or moderate incidental physical activity was linked to a lower risk of cardiovascular events and dying.
Any amount, even just a little bit.
Even a little bit seemed to help. And it wasn't just an on-off thing. They found a dose-response pattern.
Meaning the more you did, the better the outcome.
Generally, yes. Think of it like medicine a little bit might have some effect, but often a bit more has a bigger benefit, probably up to a certain point. More moderate or vigorous incidental activity correlated with lower risk.
That makes intuitive sense, I guess. More movement is usually better. But what about just light activity? Gentle walking, maybe light housework. Did that factor in?
Light incidental physical activity. Well, it did show a subtle inverse relationship, but it only reached statistical significance for death specifically from cardiovascular disease.
Okay.
And even then, it was only when people were doing quite a lot of it. We're talking more than 130 minutes per day.
Wow, that's over 2 hours.
Yeah, a considerable amount of time doing just light stuff.
Mm.
So it really looks like the intensity of the movement seems to be more key for broader protection.
Interesting. So intensity trumps duration to some extent. What about the length of these active periods? Did you need to be active for, say, 10 minutes straight? Or did really short bursts count?
That's another really important finding. They found that people who regularly had bouts or periods of moderate incidental physical activity lasting at least 3 minutes at a time.
Just 3 minutes.
Just 3 minutes at a time. They were less likely to experience cardiovascular events or death.
That seems really achievable. 3 minutes of slightly more intense activity here and there.
Exactly. What's striking is we're talking about potentially less than 5 minutes total per day, broken up, making a noticeable difference. It challenges the idea that you need one long workout session.
That's huge. So what about the average times they actually recorded? You mentioned dose response.
Right. So the median daily duration, sort of the middle value for vigorous incidental physical activity, was only about 4.6 minutes.
Under 5 minutes a day of vigorous stuff on average.
Yeah. And that level was associated with a significantly lower risk of dying from cardiovascular disease.
Okay. And for moderate?
The median for moderate incidental physical activity was around 23.8 minutes per day, so under 25 minutes. And that also showed a significantly lower risk of cardiovascular death.
So even these relatively small achievable amounts, especially the vigorous ones, seem to have a real impact.
It certainly looks that way based on this data.
Now, they also talked about a kind of health equivalence between different intensities. Can you break that down? What does that mean practically?
Yeah, that's a useful concept. The researchers estimated that roughly 1 minute of vigorous incidental activity gave about the same cardiovascular risk reduction benefit as around 2.8 to 3.4 minutes of moderate incidental activity.
Okay, so vigorous is roughly 3 times as potent as moderate, minute for minute.
Something like that, yeah. And when they compared vigorous to light activity, well, the difference was huge. 1 minute of vigorous was estimated to be equivalent to something like 35 to 48 minutes of light incidental activity.
Wow. That really highlights the power of intensity.
It does. But they also cautioned that even with those long equivalent durations, light activity just didn't seem to offer the same overall level of potential risk reduction as moderate or vigorous.
So the takeaway is, if you can manage vigorous, great. If not, aiming for moderate activity, even for slightly longer, could give similar heart benefits compared to vigorous.
That's the practical idea, yes. If climbing stairs quickly is too much, maybe a brisk walk for, say, 10 minutes could offer a benefit similar to just over 3 minutes of stair climbing.
That's really helpful for people trying to figure out what works for them. They also mentioned something about an L-shaped association with the total amount of activity. What's that about?
Right, the L shape. So imagine a graph plotting total daily incidental activity energy expenditure against cardiovascular risk.
Okay.
The L shape basically means you get the biggest drop in risk when you go from doing very little activity to doing, well, even a bit more. The steepest part of the benefit curve is right at the beginning.
So the biggest bang for your buck is just getting off the couch, essentially.
In a way, yes. After a certain amount of total activity, they estimated around 35 to 38 kilojoules per kilogram per day. You likely still get benefits from doing more, but that initial big leap in risk reduction starts to flatten out a bit.
So getting even a moderate amount of daily movement seems to make a really significant difference, maybe the most significant difference for someone starting from zero.
That seems to be the implication, yeah.
Okay, we've got a pretty good handle on what the study found. Fascinating stuff. Now, let's talk about the implications. What are the big takeaways here? How might this change how we think about activity and health?
Well, I think one of the most important implications is for public health advice. It might start shifting or maybe broadening to put more emphasis on incorporating these short bursts of moderate to vigorous activity into daily routines.
Especially for people who find gyms or structured exercise programs difficult or just unappealing.
Exactly, particularly for older adults or anyone who faces barriers to traditional exercise.
That feels really encouraging. Thinking about those everyday tasks the news article mentioned, preparing meals, cleaning the house with a bit more energy, mowing the lawn, gardening.
hmm
It sounds like these could actually be contributing meaningfully to heart health without us necessarily labeling them as exercise.
Precisely. These findings really highlight that the activities woven into the fabric of our daily lives can have a genuine impact.
And that health equivalence idea we discussed seems really practical too.
It really is. If vigorous activity isn't feasible, aiming for those slightly longer, maybe 3-to-1 ratio, periods of moderate activity could be a path to potentially similar benefits. It offers flexibility.
It also makes you think about wearable technology, doesn't it? Those accelerometers they used in the study. Could consumer devices play a bigger role?
Oh, absolutely. You can see how fitness trackers or smartwatches could potentially help people become more aware of these incidental moments of higher intensity.
Maybe even prompt you, hey, you took the stairs fast just now or something.
Potentially, yeah. Or just tracking those minutes of moderate or vigorous activity outside of planned workouts could be motivating for some people, seeing it add up.
And what about for doctors, nurses, public health folks? What's the key message they should take from this?
I think for healthcare providers, these findings suggest that recommending and encouraging incidental physical activity, especially pushing for moderate and vigorous intensity within that, is a really valuable and viable strategy for cardiovascular disease prevention.
Particularly in patients who are maybe resistant to the idea of formal exercise.
Yes, exactly. For those unwilling or perhaps unable to take up structured exercise programs, being able to say, look, even just 3 or 4 minutes of brisk walking here and there might offer similar heart benefits to 1 minute of running upstairs, that's a potentially powerful and achievable message.
Yeah, much less daunting. Okay, this all sounds incredibly positive. But, as with all research, we need to talk about the limitations. What are the caveats we should keep in mind here?
That's crucial. First and foremost, this was an observational study.
Meaning they observed links, but can't definitively prove cause and effect.
Correct. They saw that people with more incidental, moderate, vigorous activity had better outcomes, but we can't be 100% certain that the activity caused the better outcomes. There could be other unmeasured factors at play. It shows a strong association, not necessarily causation.
That's always important to remember with this type of study. Were there any other limitations related to how they collected the data?
Well, they did mention about a 5.5-year time lag between when participants first reported being non-exercisers and when they actually wore the accelerometers.
So people's habits could have changed in that time.
Potentially, yes. Although the researchers did look into this and found that people's self-reported exercise status tended to be quite stable over time, so they felt it likely didn't skew the results too much.
Okay.
And as we touched on with confounders, while they adjusted for many factors, you can never rule out all possible unmeasured influences. Residual confounding is always a possibility.
Right.
However, they did perform some additional statistical tests calculating E-values, they're called, which suggested that any unmeasured confounder would need to have a pretty strong effect to completely explain away the links they found for moderate and vigorous activity.
So the associations look fairly robust, even if not definitive proof of cause.
That's a fair summary, yes.
And what about the participants themselves? UK Biobank? Is that group representative of everyone?
That's another point the researchers acknowledged. Participants in the UK Biobank aren't perfectly representative of the entire UK population. They tend to be slightly healthier, for example.
Okay.
But other research using UK Biobank data has suggested that even with this limitation, the kinds of associations found between lifestyle factors like physical activity and health outcomes are often quite similar to what you see in the general population. So the findings are likely still broadly relevant.
Okay, good to know. So even with those limitations considered, the findings seem pretty compelling. What was the main conclusion the researchers themselves drew from all this?
Their core message really was that incidental physical activity, especially when it hits that moderate or vigorous intensity level, holds significant value for cardiovascular health.
Particularly for those who struggle with traditional exercise.
Exactly. They also highlighted how using the device-based measurements, the accelerometers, gave them a much more precise picture of people's real-world activity compared to just relying on questionnaires.
That objective data is key.
And they believe these findings could really help shape more nuanced, more context-specific physical activity guidelines in the future, moving beyond just recommending structured exercise.
So finding ways to integrate more intense movement into daily routines.
Yes. They concluded that strategies focusing on that could really expand the feasible options people have for reducing their cardiovascular risk.
This has been incredibly insightful. So let's bring it back to you, our listener. What's the main message you should be taking away from this deep dive today?
Well, we'd really encourage you to just take a moment and think about your own daily routine. Where are the opportunities, even small ones, to inject a bit more moderate intensity activity? We're talking just a few minutes here and there, potentially making a difference.
Yeah, think about those things you might already be doing. Could you walk just a bit faster when you're running errands? Maybe take the stairs instead of the lift sometimes? Put a bit more oomph into cleaning or gardening?
Carry the groceries with a bit more purpose.
Right. These can all count towards that moderate intensity level.
Exactly. And based on this research, even seemingly small increases in your daily activity, especially if you can up the intensity just a notch, could accumulate and potentially contribute to better heart health over time.
So here's a final thought to leave you with. If just 3 minutes, think about that, just 3 minutes of intentional moderate activity scattered through your day could potentially shift your cardiovascular risk profile in a positive direction.
Yeah.
What small, realistic change could you make starting today?
It's definitely something worth pondering, isn't it?
Thanks for tuning in to the Health Headliner podcast by To Do Digital. Like and subscribe for more health news and breakthroughs. Stay healthy and informed. See you next time.